The last property with all of this sizing that we have to talk about is flex basis. Let me get our container back to a spot where we only have 4. So I'll just comment out those just in case we need them later. So now we have 4 items which are explicitly set to 50 pixels wide each. So we set each of them to 50 pixels wide, 50 pixels tall. Now, if we wanted to change those dimensions, we can actually do that using a flex item property. Let's go to the first flex item and set the flex basis to equal 40%. What you'll see is that this first item gets a lot wider, and it's not because it's trying to fill the empty space, it's because it's respecting this flex basis property over the width property that we set earlier. So by default, this flex basis is actually set to auto, and when it's set to auto, what that is basically saying is to Flexbox is go ahead and look for the width and height properties, and if you find them, respect those properties as the width and height of the flex items. If you don't find them, go ahead and size the flex items based on the inner content. And that's the default for flex basis. But you can also assign pixel units and percentage units to the flex basis to override the width and height of your flex items. This unlocks a lot of possibilities, and depending on how you use them with flex grow and flex shrink, you can get a bunch of different combinations. So if I was looking at this flex box right here, I have the 4 items, each 50 pixels wide, and let's say that I wanted to make them even widths and span them across the whole container. One way that I could do that is by coming to each of the flex items and setting the flex grow to be equal to 1. And what that's going to do is equally allocate the empty space as we just talked about. So that's one way to do it. Now we could also backtrack a little bit, and instead of doing that, we can set the flex basis to 25% on each of the items, and that's going to equally give width to each of the items and give you the same exact result. Now if we come in and try to set the flex grow property on one of the items, it's not going to change because the flex basis is going to take precedence over that. But in some cases, maybe you don't set the flex basis property on all of the items to equal 100%. So in this case, we've given each of them 25%, which adds up to 100, so it's going to fill the whole container. But let's say that for the first item, we give it 10%. So we're going to be missing 15% of the container, and let me delete that for a second. So now we just have flex basis properties, and they sum up to what, 85%, if I'm calculating that correctly. So there's some empty space here on the right. It doesn't fully fill the container. But now if I put on the flex grow property and set it to 1, that first element is going to take the remaining space, and we're back where we started. So essentially, setting a flex basis of 25 on the last 3 and 10% plus a flex grow of 1 is the same as just doing flex basis of 25% on all of them. So many ways to get to the same answer. The last thing we'll talk about is the order of the items along the main axis in our flex container. So if you wanted to swap these out, so maybe you wanted to put number 2 in number 1's place, you could do that. All you have to do is come up to the HTML and put number 2 before number 1. And that should just flip them. But in Flexbox, you don't even have to do that. You can actually flip those with CSS. So if I came down to the CSS and I looked at flex item number 1 and I gave it an order of 2, and then I gave flex item 2 an order of 1, now you're going to see that these are flipped. And hold on. I think the reason that this is not working is because you have to set them on all. So we'll set the order on 3 as 3 and the order on 4 as 4. So the 3 and 4 have their natural order, but then 2 and 1 are going to be flipped. So if you set order on all of the flex items, you can determine, the order that they come in. Now you might ask, why is this useful? Well, in many cases it's really not useful. You might as well just change the order of your HTML and be done with it. But if you are designing responsively, which we talked about in a prior video, I think it was just the previous video, as you're resizing your browser, you may want different elements on the page to go in different orders. So say you have a nav bar at the top, you've got main content, a sidebar, and a footer. Maybe you want to order those differently, whether you're on a desktop or a mobile device. And this would be how you would do that, is you'd set a media query. So you might come down and say @media, and we'd say like min width of 600px or something like that. And then in here, you could probably set the flex item number 4 to have an order of 1. And then we'll say a flex item 1 will be in order of 4, something like that. So as we are getting bigger than 600px, that's how that's going to show, but as we shrink it, you'll see that those flip. So we can resize and order them differently based on different screens. At this point, you've learned pretty much all of the main properties of Flexbox. Now, of course, there's some shorthand properties that can make your life easier. So instead of, setting the flex basis and the grow and the shrink values, what you can do is come in and just say flex, and then the first value is going to be the flex grow. So maybe you want to set that to 1, and then the second one's flex shrink, you might set that to 1, and then the third one is going to be flex basis, which is set to auto. So this is a shorthand way of writing flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis all in one line. So that's just a shorthand property, but not necessary. I wouldn't even recommend using those until you're very comfortable with Flexbox. Well, this is actually a brand new day, same hat, same hoodie, whatever, but I forgot to add the last part to this video, which is actually taking this previous challenge that we had solved. So as you're following along with the full stack roadmap, we solved this pricing card challenge as a part of the original HTML and CSS tutorials, and then also made it responsive in the prior video on responsive web design. What I want to do to wrap up this video is take this design and make it with Flexbox instead of how we did it before. So if I'll remind you just for a moment, what we had to do to get these bottom left and bottom right sections sitting next to each other with a 50% width was something a little bit hacky. If we come up to the HTML, you'll see right here. So this line doesn't look, all that spectacular, but what you'll see is we've got a closing div right here that corresponds to the bottom left section div, and then the starting div for the bottom right section is sitting right next to it, which when you're looking at HTML, that's generally not very good syntax, and that was kind of a hack that we used to remove the white space and allow for the fact that we had 50% widths on both of them. So if I were to enter this down one line just for formatting's sake, you'll see that the bottom right piece of the card actually disappears, and that's because it's going underneath that bottom left card, and then we're hiding the overflow, as you'll see in the CSS for the main card. So we've got overflow hidden. So if we take that off, you'll see it pop up below here. So that's what's going on, and we can solve this very easily using Flexbox and get rid of all of our hacky solutions that we had before. Now, to make this a little bit simpler for us to see exactly how this is working, let's go back to our layout example. This is what we had used to originally build the card so that we could see what we were dealing with, and we didn't have to confuse ourselves with all of the different styling while we're just trying to focus on layout. It isn't pretty, but it will work for our layout purposes at least. And what you'll see is I've come down and added a media query. This is from the prior video. If you haven't watched that, we talk about responsive design and media queries. So basically what we're saying is in this block, we want to apply certain styles to any device that is greater than 500 or greater than or equal to 576 pixels. As you'll see when we shrink this, it changes the layout, and then when we go above 576, then these two style selectors will apply, and you'll see that the width and the height of the card gets applied, and then the bottom left and bottom right section are going to get a 50% width each. Now with Flexbox, this is relatively simple. All we have to do is, if we're looking at this entire card here, it's composed of a top section and a bottom section with two left and right sub-bottom sections. And what we want to do is on the desktop device, so this, what we're looking at right here, we want to have those bottom sections in one row. And then when we shrink it to mobile, we want it to come into a column. So if you remember from just a few minutes ago, we talked about the flex direction, where we can take the main axis and change it based on that flex direction. So what I'm thinking is that for a desktop device, we want flex direction equal to row so that these two go right next to each other. And then on a mobile device, we want it to be in a column. So the way that we do that, since we're designing mobile first here, is we come up to all the main styles here and we go to the bottom section, because that's what we want to turn into a flex container. We don't necessarily want to turn the whole card into a flex container because the top section is actually fine and it would be overkill to put a Flexbox container on it. But the bottom section is not. So let's go into the bottom section and type display flex. And what you'll see is, I believe nothing will happen at the moment because we're in the desktop view, but let's go ahead and go to the mobile view, and now we've got some things messed up because we're designing mobile first, so right now we're working on the mobile device. So these are still sitting next to each other, and all we have to do to change that is set the flex direction to column. And you'll see that they jump right above each other. That's pretty much it when it comes to the mobile design of this. Let's see if we can find anything that we can remove now. I believe we can remove this vertical line. Okay, we're going to get to this. We'll actually get to this. Let's get the design right first, and then we will worry about that. So at the moment, we set the flex direction to column, and because of that, because we're designing mobile first, that is also going to apply to the desktop design unless we change it in our media query. So let's do that. We'll say bottom section, and we'll give it a flex direction of row again, so the default. So now as we resize, we get a very similar result, and we're actually pretty much done. But we have some redundant styles that we can actually remove now that we're using Flexbox, and this is where the nice parts of Flexbox come in. You don't have to write as much CSS. So we can remove the bottom left and bottom right section widths, and I believe that may screw us up a bit after we change a few things. Hold on. I think we need to change, let's remove the display inline block on the bottom left section and the bottom right. We will remove the 100% width, and we'll remove the vertical align top. So we don't need those anymore. But what you'll notice is now we've got this screwed up, and that is by design. That's not surprising. Let's make sure our mobile is still working. So we're good here. Mobile's still working, but desktop has a little bit of work. And if you remember, the bottom section is our flex container, which means, based on the HTML here, if we're looking at it, the bottom section has two direct children. It has the bottom left section and the bottom right section. And we can actually enter this down on to its new line. Now that we're using Flexbox, we don't have to have that hack. But anyways, the bottom left and right section are the children. So therefore, these two style selectors are going to be the flex items. In this desktop view, we have the flex direction set to row, which means that that bottom section has a main axis that is going horizontal. And if you remember from a few minutes ago, the way that we resize the flex items along the main axis is going to be one of two ways. We can use the flex grow property, or we can use the flex basis. So let's come in here and just try both of them just so I can show you. We'll start with the flex basis. It may be a little more straightforward. So if you put in 50% on the bottom left section and then you say flex basis 50% on the bottom right section, we have completed the card, it looks great, and as we resize it, it's still going to work. So that's one solution. Another solution is we could come in and we could say flex grow, set that equal to 1, and flex grow equal to 1 on the bottom right section. And this should work just fine too. Now going directly from flex basis to flex grow will not really illustrate that point. Let's get rid of the flex grows for just a second so that we can conceptualize. By default, these two sub-containers down here have a natural width because we haven't given them an explicit width, so they're going to take the content width. The content sitting within them, as you can see, is filling the entire width of their container. Now, these do not fill up the entire section. We've got this empty space here on the right. And the flex grow property is what applies when we have that empty space. And so basically what we're going to do when we enable the flex grow 1 properties, like we talked about, is we're going to split up that space, just give it 1 unit to the bottom left section and 1 unit to the bottom right, and therefore it's going to be, I believe, perfectly equal. Or it actually may not be perfectly equal. It may just be a coincidence that the content is a similar width. Let me make sure that that's correct. So let's just enable these and we can check in the dev tools. So let's inspect and let's see what we're dealing with. So this one is 263 pixels wide. This is 276 pixels wide. So glad we looked at this. I actually was not thinking about this correctly. The correct solution here is probably going to be the flex basis of 50%. It just looks like they're equal when we use the flex grow because they're similar widths by default. Like naturally the content has a similar width in both sections. But if I close out the dev tools and let's say I came up here and just added a bunch of content to one of the list items in the bottom right, you'll see that now that flex grow is not working quite as well because we're not giving them equal widths, we're growing them based on their natural size. So I stand corrected, that is not the correct way to do it. Flex grow, at least. I think flex basis is by far the most reliable way to split these into equal containers. So we'll go with that and call it a day. I think we have solved this to my liking. So this is the basic layout, and then as we shrink it, it goes down to mobile. So as we come over to here, back to our card, and let me bring this guy back up so that we can see everything working okay. So there's our card. Now we got to turn this into a Flexbox, and we'll do exactly what we just did in the layout example. So if you remember, we came down, we didn't need any of that. We did need a bottom section. We wanted the flex direction to be row on a desktop device. And then in the bottom section, we need to display flex, set the flex direction to column. And let's see what we got here. Looks good. Now we just wanted to remove on the bottom left and bottom right sections. I know there's a lot more styles here. We don't need this guy. We don't need the vertical lines. We don't need the width. All we have to do is add a flex basis of 50% on each of these. So we're looking good there. And I believe we have solved it. I don't think there's anything that we did otherwise. Now there's just one more thing that I want to show you with this that we could use Flexbox for. As you see this $29 per month, these are sitting next to each other. And whenever you have horizontal content, it's usually a decent use case for Flexbox. Let's look at the HTML that we set this up with. So you'll see that we have a price container. That would be the overall parent, and then that parent has two children items. So if we turned price container into a flex container, then the price and the price frequency would therefore become the flex items. Let's find that in our CSS. So here's the price container. We've just set a margin on it, so that's probably going to stay the same even with the flex container. But then we also have price and price frequency, which looks like we have styled right above it. So let me just change the order of this because it makes a little more sense to have the container on top. And what we're going to do is set display flex. By default, it's going to be set to row, so it will put them next to each other. Let's get rid of all the styles that we have within these. I don't think that we need any of them except for maybe the font size and the opacity, because those are not layout related properties. So here's our starting point, and you can see that by default, even after we removed all those styles, that display flex, making that whole container a flex container, is going to still put them next to each other. Now let's just back up and remember exactly what's going on here. We have some HTML where we have a price container, and then we have two items within it. So we have a flex container and two flex items. By default, we've set this to display flex, which makes the main axis on the horizontal, so in a row. And therefore, if we want to align things along the main axis, we use justify content. If we want to align them on the cross axis, we use align items. As you can see, the per month is a little bit misaligned with that $29. An easy way to fix that is to come onto the price container, set the align items, and set those to center. You'll see that that perfectly centers those two right next to each other, and that's a much better solution than what we did before, where we set the position to relative and then we set it -3 pixels to just pull it up a little bit. The last thing we have to do, as you'll notice, there's no spacing between these, and there's no real solution here with the Flexbox. I mean, we could come in here and justify content and say something like space between, but you'll see that that's going to space it out way too much. So that's not really going to help us. So really the best way to do this is just come on to the either the price frequency or the price item and set a margin. So we don't even need this style anymore. Since this is already written, the price frequency, we can just use this, and all we have to say, because this is the per month piece, all we have to say is margin left and give it something like 5 pixels. And that spaces it out nicely, very easy and straightforward. So there you have it. That is how we solve this with a mobile first, fully responsive solution with Flexbox. And it shrinks and gets bigger, and it looks great on all devices. The next part of this lesson is going to be a separate video. So the next video, I'm not exactly sure when it's going to be released, pretty soon though, and we're going to be building that testimonial grid. So this grid right here, we're going to be building this with HTML and CSS, and we're going to be using Flexbox as a way to lay out these elements on the page, and then of course design them responsively so that they stack on top of each other on a mobile device.